Hello and welcome to the next of our lecture recaps. This is a recap of our lecture on the external environment. Don't forget that you can get all of these mind maps for free as a PDF on the website shown, or indeed you can purchase the full course on which this is based should you wish to do so. So remember, we're looking at the external environment to try to set the strategy of the firm. So the exam focus in this will be to evaluate. We may well need to evaluate the strategic direction of a firm and say, does it fit in with the external environment? So what will we do? Well, we use one of these models that we've got to identify the key issues. We'll decide how significant each issue is, and we'll take a wide view to try and decide what the best option is. So the first model we looked at was a pest analysis, or a pestel analysis with the two extra letters. So what is this? Well, this looks at the macro environment, i.e. the environment as a whole outside the organisation, particularly looking for changes in that environment. This will enable us to identify market decline or market growth. So this is feeding into our position analysis, looking for those opportunities and threats within our SWOT analysis. So what do we have here? The factors that we have in a pestel analysis. Well, the P of our pestel is looking at political factors that may influence the organisation. So that could be government changes, which means that legislation may change. It may be changes in taxation or conflict with the government. It may be that we move on to economic factors, looking at things like unemployment, looking at interest rates, looking at inflation, foreign exchange rates, or the deficit. All of these may have an impact on the business depending on what type of business it is. Social factors that we need to consider will be education of the workforce, the culture within that workforce, and the income that they require. Moving on to the T in pestel, and we have our technological obsolescence, for example, innovation, research and development. All of these can have a big impact on the business. Adding on the E and the L to our pest, the E is for environmental, which is becoming increasingly important, taking a view of the impact of the business on the environment. And the L is for legal, which is particularly looking at legislative changes. So we looked in detail at these in illustration 1, but remember, pestel analysis is for analysing the external environment of the firm to make sure that a strategy we decide upon fits in with that external environment. Another thing we'll need to understand outside the firm is our competitors. So we can use Porter's 5 forces to look at this. So Porter identified the competition within an industry and said that it's influenced by 5 factors. Those 5 factors or forces are: number 1, the threat of new entrants. So are there barriers to entry to prevent those new entries, such as economies of scale or capital required, or indeed distribution networks required? If they do enter the market, can we undertake retaliation? Is there legislation to prevent them? Or indeed, will people be loyal to our brand rather than using those new entrants? The next force he identified was the bargaining power of buyers. For example, big supermarkets buying from farmers. They have a lot of power. They can set the terms to those farmers. Also then, on the other side of that, maybe the suppliers are the ones with the power. Maybe they hold a very important source of supply and there are no other suppliers. Or indeed, maybe there are large switching costs, which means that the bargaining power of suppliers would be high and the business would need to take account of that. We also then had the threat of substitutes, so that could be direct or indirect substitutes, and we might need to undertake a branding exercise to make sure that people distinguish between them and our particular brand. All of this leads to the competition in the industry, and that will depend upon the state of the market, the life cycle of the product, and whether it's a homogeneous product or it's easily branded. There are some limitations to Porter's 5 forces. Remember, in fast-moving industries, it might be too slow to actually use this analysis. The government isn't included in this analysis, and they can influence, as we've seen through our pestel analysis. It also ignores collaboration between the different competitors in the market through joint ventures and alliances. And we looked at Porter's 5 forces in illustration 2. We then moved on to look at the industry life cycle. So this industry life cycle analysis looks at the different stages of the industry, and of course we'll need to understand what stage of the industry we're at so that we can set a strategy that fits in with that industry life cycle. So if it's in the introduction stage, this means we'd have an innovative product where we would have low sales and high costs because it's just been introduced to the market, and there'll be limited competition. So the main point here will be your strategy when it comes to pricing. Do you undertake price skimming or penetration pricing, both of which we look at later on in the module? A growth then, if it's at the growth phase in the industry, that means we'll have growing sales. There'll be more competition and new segments will be created. The price will be falling at this stage because new competitors will be coming into the market. That moves on into the maturity stage where there's lots of competition, where the price will become much more sensitive and you need to try and anticipate change, particularly the move into the decline phase. That decline phase is then highlighted by a reduced amount of competition as people leave the industry. The price will begin to fall as people are disinvested from that product. The implications then of the product life cycle is that we need to diversify. So we need to have mature products that are making good profits that can fund the early stage products that will then take their place later. Our competencies must change within the life cycle, so we'll be focusing on, for example, advertising at the introduction phase and cost cutting at the decline phase. Predicting the life cycle may be difficult to do, and you may actually cause the product, for example, to go into decline if you don't advertise it enough. So your strategy must be flexible to fit in with those different stages in the life cycle. So we looked at those in detail in illustration 3. The last thing we mentioned was our competitor analysis. So our competitors will be identified in our 5 forces analysis. And then once we've identified those competitors, we'll want to do a detailed analysis of them. So what will this analysis involve? Well, we'll want to identify what competitive advantage those competitors have. We want to gain an insight into them and establish both their future strategies and ours, and we may well learn from them when we set our strategy. So how do we go about doing that? Well, first of all, we need to identify the competition. There'll be brand competitors, there'll be industry competitors, there'll be form competitors, genetic competitors. We need to analyse those competitors, look at their objectives, look at the strategy they're following, assess any assumptions that they have made about us or indeed that we have made about them. Look at the resources and competencies they have and compare them to what we have within our own organisation. We then need to develop a response. It may be that we take a laid-back response because we don't feel that they are doing as well as we are. We may take a selective response and choose to compete with certain areas that they're involved in. We could take a tiger response and really decide to go after that competitor. And we looked at that in illustration 4. So that was a recap of the second of our lectures on the external environment.